Welcome to the weekly podcast of First United Methodist Church in Costa Mesa, California. Founded in 1912, the church gathers on Sundays at 10 a.m., and we invite you to join us anytime. For more information, visit our website, costamesafirst.umc.com, or connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter.
Our reading this morning is from 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 9, on divisions in the Corinthian church. And so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food. Even now you are still not ready, for you are still of the flesh. For as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh, and behaving according to human inclinations? For when one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos, are you not merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to the labor of each. For we are God's servants working together. You are God's field. God is building. The word of God for the people of God.
Well, friends, it is indeed good to be together. And we have been in a series, and if you're just jumping in, no worries. We are in a series on authenticity. And there are some people in the room who are like, what? Now I'm out of here. Authenticity, this idea of vulnerability, all the things that we hear often, kind of it's become a catchphrase. People use it all the time. But what does it mean, and why does it matter? How are we to become who we were meant to become, and what I would argue what we already are? How are we to get in touch with who we are? And so we've been talking about the different ways that we can be authentic with ourselves and with God, because we believe that our very essence is that we are the beloved. You may have noticed that when you walked in, there was a huge, very subtle sign that we have out there that says, you are already loved by God, which is actually a pretty big theological statement. There are many suggestions that maybe our very state, our very essence is our brokenness. But what does it look like to believe that if our authentic or very base selves is that we are beloved? What does that look like? How do we live that out? Last week, we gave away a bunch of copies of my book, and I am grateful to the person who bought one for everybody in the room. We still have extras if you didn't get a chance to get one. We've been doing this challenge of 21 days living an authentic life. If you're new here, the funny part of all of this, guys, is that this isn't me. Those of you who know me know that Bex and I share a love for a felt hat. And so my publisher found a stock photo of someone who kind of looks like me and put it on the cover of a book about authenticity. I still find that funny. This week, we are going to talk about how to be authentic with what we do. So let us pray, as always, as we jump into this together and hear a little bit about Paul and Apollos. So God, as always, with the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of us gathered here in this space and online, be acceptable to you, because, God, you are indeed our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we have been in this series, or kind of understanding, why is it that we need to be authentic with, who we are? Aren't we just, who we are naturally? And I would say, no. We have done a lot of work to learn how to kind of wear different masks. Some of us grew up maybe in religious settings that required us to believe certain things or project certain things about ourselves. And so we kind of sometimes don't even know, like, which one is me? And so the first week we talked about what does it mean to understand ourselves as beloved? And so we used the verse, the baptismal story, which we talk about at least once a year. We talked about how in the baptism, Jesus is declared the beloved with whom God is well pleased. And Jesus, at this point, has done nothing to deserve that. And maybe that is the truth about us. Maybe we don't have to do anything to deserve the amazing love of God, and yet we can offer that also to others. And if we start with that as our base level, then the next week we kind of talked about the idea of, like, how do we be authentic with our relationships? And so we did a bunch of challenges, and I think some folks, you were so bold and brave to think about the different ways that you are authentic with yourselves. And so I made people look into a mirror last week, and we kind of passed the mirror around. And by the way, that practice is normally done just by staring in a mirror, but I didn't make you do that. But I have since heard really funny reports that some people turn their phone in selfie mode, and we're like looking at it during worship, which, has anyone else been like shocked by the moment you don't know your phone is in selfie mode? You're like, I look like that? That's a weird experience when you think your phone is going to show someone else and then shows you all the chins you weren't like expecting to see. But like that moment, how many of us walk by the mirror and think things about ourselves that aren't true at all, but for some reason we live outside of our authentic selves or don't even know how to think good things about ourselves? And what does that matter? Because if we talk about the idea of being created by the divine, how could we reject the thing that God has created? And then we live in these relationships that sometimes are so fragmented, or we're not being authentic, they're not being authentic. And then there's just this continued sense of not being who we were created to be. If you look at the bulletin, there's these photos from, I think it's like the 90s. These are also stock photos, by the way, because people were guessing the first Sunday whose yearbook we like photocopied. It was great. Like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's Evie. No, people were trying to figure out like who different people were. But isn't high school the time where often we learn to wear some pretty big masks? For those of you who are about to enter high school, it seems like that's the time you need to like define yourself or figure out who you are meant to become. But then there is also this sense of, how do I live out what? If we talk about who, what, how am I authentic with what I do? And by what, I mean, what do you do with your time? I love, if you haven't ever come to a welcome dessert, I welcome you to our welcome dessert. But one of the things that I loved about the very first welcome dessert that David and I threw together is that David Trotter, who works here in the community, never asks, what do you do for work? He says, what do you do with your time? Which threw me, because it's genius, because not everybody works, but also it makes people stop and think. Because whether we are working from home, whether we are retired, we still have a vocation. We still do something with our time. In fact, I recently was looking at this again. I looked at all these statistics for when I first wrote the book. We spend 90,000 hours of our life doing work. For those of you who raise children, you do even more hours. That's a lot of time. Maybe you're a full-time student. Maybe you have a full-time job. Maybe you're retired. Whatever it may be, you do a lot of things with your vocation. And by vocation, I mean kind of the way that you are in the world, or what you do with your time. So why is it important that we're authentic in those spaces? And the truth of the matter is how can we be authentic in those spaces? For some of us, We have to wear masks. There is a certain expectation that people have of us, that we behave a certain way at school, or we need to act a certain way at work. There are people in this room that if their work knew they were here, they actually could get in trouble because their work doesn't like them being at a certain kind of church. So I'm not necessarily saying that you demand that people accept everything about what you do, or that you allow yourself to be in danger when you are too authentic. And remember, we talked the first week, authenticity isn't about like sharing every little bit of piece of yourself with other people. Like, you do you, boo, is not exactly what we're talking about here. It's more this deep-rooted sense of self that when we live out of that, our authenticity shows through. One of the challenges this week that we had was for folks to delete unnecessary follows. If you follow people, like I went through a season where I just subscribed to every newsletter that had to do with like leadership. And then what I would do every week is delete them with just a huge amount of guilt. Or it would be like, you need to build your platform. Or I had all these different sort of emails I was getting that at the time I was like really sincere that like, ooh, I need these. These are really going to help me. Is anyone else like a subscriber? No? Yes, thank you. It's like, I wish I was the person I thought I was when I subscribed to that. There were all these talks I would go to, and I'd hear the speaker and be like, I should get their daily message. And you know what I would end up doing? Looking at it going, why don't I write a daily email? What am I doing with my life? So if I was going to be authentic with my time, I had to be authentic with the fact, like, I don't actually read all of those emails. And y'all don't read all your emails either, because the number of text messages I get that I want to be like, just look at the church email. I want to read to you this. Sometimes I find myself in a cycle of cynicism or dissatisfaction, and that can happen to all of us. Perhaps you're in such a cycle right now, or perhaps you have recently found yourself in one. This challenge takes us out of that cycle and asked us to see the good that God has already given us. When we focus, when we're able to put our time to invest in the things that like we actually do, we're able to see more clearly kind of the good of what we do and when we're authentic with it. Okay, so then we get this verse that's kind of weird. And guys, Dave Reed is one of my favorite liturgists, the way you read scripture. You could just come and read every night to me. It's so good. But he was reading to practice to make sure he had all the words before you guys got here. And I don't think he knew I was listening. I was sitting right there and he goes, oh, that's good. I just imagine like someone up there being like, yeah, thanks, I wrote that. This is an interesting story. And we might miss it because like, I need you to notice that like Paul in the start of this is really kind of like, he's being really sassy with the Corinthians, like really sassy. Like he's like, hey, because he had just like talked about these ideas of like spiritual beings. And he's like, but that's not you, friends. Because you can imagine he's like describing this like really great church and everyone's like, he's talking about us. I kind of imagine them acting like, I don't know if you ever watched like the Academy Awards or the SAG Awards. And do you ever see the actors or directors who think they're going to win and then don't? Do you know what I'm talking about? They're I love when they like, you should be a better actor than that. But they like look like, oh, you know. And I imagine the Corinthians are sort of sitting around and Paul's like talking about like all these things of what it means to be spiritual people. And they're like, that does sound like us. And then he calls them children who he can't even give solid food to. That is the meanest thing anyone has said. And you guys are like, sounds good in the Bible. Dave over here thinks it's great. Why is he doing that? Because he realizes that they've become so focused on being followers of Paul that they've forgotten that that's like not what they're supposed to be about. They're supposed to be about followers of God. See, they've gotten really tied up in saying like, I'm a follower of this person or I'm a follower of that person. And Paul, who I'm going to say this, you guys know my feelings about Paul. I often joke that Paul and I, we're kind of like the people who dated like in high school and then broke up in college. Right? Like I thought Paul was great until I really started reading Paul, and we kind of broke up for a while. And then we'd like talk about our mutual friend Jesus, but that was about it. And then I like re-engaged Pauline scholarship and have discovered a lot of great things about Paul. But Paul, I'll say, does not have a small ego, right? He'd be like, of all people, like he has a lot of sentences like this. So for him to come out and say like, some of you are claiming me and some of you are claiming Apollos, is this really interesting sort of shift in language. See, he's being really honest and authentic about what his work is. Paul isn't excited that all these people are following him. Paul is worried that they're missing the point. Now, what I also want us to notice is when we are authentic, see, Paul is authentic about like, guys, you've kind of got it all wrong. And it's not a false humility, but like, here's the point. Really, really, guys, it's about each other and about God. And we need to focus on that. And he even points out his own humanity. But I want us to notice too, he doesn't knock Apollos. He doesn't say, like, I'm doing this thing, you're doing that thing, right? Instead, he kind of says this thing where like Apollos has got his gig, I've got my gig, and both of them aren't as important as the whole thing. Sometimes I think we get so caught up in thinking that we need to be a certain thing or do a certain job or like one job is more important than another. And we miss out on like, what is our authentic call? Amy mentioned the anxiety earlier of like wanting to find the right kind of job for her. It's so hard to figure out like what we want to do with our time if we're so busy thinking about the shoulds and the coulds and I need to be this person or that person. And oftentimes we miss out on this unique calling that we have. And what I love is if we look at this verse really carefully, we see that Paul says that both he and Apollos are only part of it. And even like the original language, it says, Apollos watered, I planted, but God gave the growth. And that's actually not a great translation because it actually says, so the past tense of like, we did this, but God is growing. Almost the suggestion of like, there will be many different people who will bring many different parts. And if we get really upset about making sure that, we need to be just like everyone else and we miss out on our like unique thing. And it's really easy to do because let me tell you guys, marketing is all about comparison. And churches get like this. Look, friends, pastors hear when you say like, oh yeah, I liked this pastor, but then I didn't like this pastor. And we're like, oh, I don't want to become the pastor they don't like. And so we really try to like become all things to all people and it doesn't work, does it? I had a friend who was a pastor and he had gotten really, really well known. And this other pastor had got really well known by talking about how awful that other pastor was. I'm not kidding you. And in fact, my friend had written a book and this person wrote a book against that book, which I'm like, I think kind of got to feel a little good, right? You're like, I'm doing something right. If you took the time to write a book against my book. And I remember asking him how he was feeling about this. And he looked at me and he said something that I think is almost exactly what this Corinthians verse is saying. He said, I'm not upset. See, he's mad that I broke the rules of tennis, but I'm over here playing golf. Meaning, we're doing two different things. And that's what Paul is saying. And he's not knocking Apollos. He's just saying, I know what I am meant to do. And I know what Apollos is meant to do, or allow Apollos to do whatever Apollos is going to do. But what we need to do is focus on what our vocation is, what we are meant to be and do. I had already written this sermon, and I had a week. You guys had a week? Woo! I had a week. Just so many things to go to. Last night was my friend's parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Y'all, those 70-year-olds can party. I am so tired because we danced. We did the electric slide. It was so fun, but the week was so busy. And one of the things I was invited to do was to speak at a thing on Friday night for women in ministry. But it wasn't just for women in ministry. It was like for women in leadership. And friends, I didn't want to do it. I did not want to do it. I was like, I'm tired. I have such a busy week. I have to drive all the way down to San Diego. I had already had a class in the morning. I was so tired, but something inside of me was like, no, you need to go. And so I went. And when I got there, I met up with the associate pastor of that church, who is the Normal Heights, by the way, is the name of the church, which I just think that's great. Normal Heights. It's very Canadian of them, like not too excessive, like normal heights. We're not going to be exceptional heights. We're not going to be grand heights. Just kind of normal, middle of the line. And so I met Molly in the parking lot, and I'm literally like carrying my calendar and like, I have to send 16 emails, and I'm like running in, and she's like, cool. You okay? And I was like, I'm leaving ministry and going to Mexico. That's what came out of my mouth, like really fast. And she was like, that's a big decision. That's a lot. And I was like, I just can't do it all. And she's like, I'm really glad you're here though, because what you do, people are going to need. And I was like, thanks. Sat, did all my emails, and then walked into the room. And what I had been asked to do was to sit on this panel. And there were women from various fields. Guys, I want you to imagine your pastor sitting on a panel with the person over here was the highest ranked female in the Air Force chaplaincy program. The woman sitting right here was a retired diplomat to the Middle East. Cool. The person right here, sitting this side of me, she is one of the most amazing Old Testament scholars. She made the Old Testament funny. She was our keynote speaker, and she was talking about the women in Exodus, and I was like, oh, wow, that's inspiring. And then the person to the right of her, very unimpressive, lead of like Sharps, Sharps hospitals, head ER doctor of all of the Sharps hospitals. And I'm all, cool, I have a church. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know. Like, what am I doing there? What is my work? And all of a sudden I'm like, okay, how do I sound impressive when they ask questions? Do I use big words? And all of a sudden I just like kind of had one of those moments where I was like, no, I think I'll just be me. So I'm sitting there and they ask all these questions. And one of the questions they asked is like, who is the most, like, if you think about someone from your past, a woman from your past that like kind of gave you permission or helped you understand what it was going to be like to be a woman in a field where there aren't a lot of women. And for whatever reason, I thought about the story. And then they said one of our biggest challenges, with being a woman in ministry. And one of my memories from seminary was from one of the first days of class. And so I went to Duke in North Carolina. And so you can imagine there are people from all different denominations, some of which had a tough time with the fact that I brought ovaries into the room. And so I'm a woman. And so I'm walking in the hallway, and it's my first week, and there's this guy with just the most Southern accent you've ever heard. And I'm like behind him, and he says, I don't even know why they're here. And I was like, who? Like trying to figure out. And he's like, why do women think they can do this? And I was like, what year is it? It was not that long ago, guys. And it was interesting because in that moment, as I'm in the hallway, like in this incredible institution, here is this person who is suggesting that just because I'm a woman, I can't do ministry. And I was reminded of my grandmother. My grandmother, who is a very salty northern British woman, just the most practical, reasonable human you've ever met. Oh, Siri is talking, guys. And my grandmother was not one to ever brag, or it just wasn't practical to brag, right? And so I didn't know how weird it was or strange it was that my grandmother was a chemist. And what that means in England is my grandmother was a pharmacist. There weren't a lot of female pharmacists in the 40s and 50s, friends. And my grandfather once told me, and he didn't always share these stories because my grandmother didn't like them being shared, but my grandmother would go to class, and oftentimes the professors would figure out a way to lock out the women. And so my grandmother, who my grandfather claimed was always smarter than him, would sit in the hallway and hear the teachers teach with all the other females that had been locked out. Rude. And I remember thinking with my backpack as I'm walking in, who is this guy to tell me what I can and cannot do? So I told this story, and everyone in the room seemed to be awake, so it was good. And at the end, there was I kind of was packing up my stuff after hearing all the impressive things that these people had shared. One of them about a consulate being stormed, and she got all these people to count paper clips so they didn't notice that they were being stormed. Amazing stories. And as I look up, there's a line of people to talk to me, of women, younger women. And this one girl is there, and she's clearly blind. And she says to me, I wasn't going to come, but I got a ride, and I'm a college student. And she said, I spent all day today sitting in my dean's offices begging to be let into classes. It's 2020. And she said, because I can't see, I can't actually go to the chapel at my school because they have a light show, and it bothers the part of my eyes that do work. So I have to sit outside of chapel because the school she goes to requires chapel. What? But she said, your sharing makes me want to do what I'm supposed to do. And she said, oh, by the way, I just applied to seminaries, and I'm going to call them and make sure they all have Braille. Sometimes when we are just authentic with who we are, it empowers other people to be authentic or to hear their own calling in a different way. The next girl in line, same thing. I wasn't going to go to seminary because I wasn't sure, but hearing you talk, you're actually cool, and I feel like I can still be cool and be a pastor. And I was like, who are you meeting that are pastors? But I get it. I go to the meetings too. Sometimes we don't realize the uniqueness God has given us. And it seems so easy because for us, existing in our own skin, it's well, this is just what I do and who I am. And Paul recognized his uniqueness in this call. And aren't we glad that Paul did what Paul did? I wish he'd left out some of the things he said, but I am glad. I want us to take a moment. I'm going to invite the band to come forward. There's two of them. Where are they? There. Nope. You're wearing the same color. It's like wearing red in Target. They're going to come forward in a minute. But what I want you to do is that card that you have, that some of you are taking notes on. I love that. I want us to do a little practice together. And this might feel weird, I know, but I'm not making you look in a sign. I want us to think of 5 things that we like about what we do right now. Now, whether you're retired or you're in middle school or high school or whatever it is, what are 5 things? Because the practice of gratefulness really grounds us in what we're doing. Because a lot of us have the I'm going to run away moment like I did on Friday. So what are 5 things? 5 things that you're grateful for. Now, the next thing I want you to do, and you're going to have time to do this, and I will repeat, so don't worry, is I want you to write 3 things on the other side or on it. Again, you're not turning it in. This is just for you. 3 things that are unique about the way that you do what you do. whatever it is. How do you do things differently? Because again, Paul and Apollos had similar callings, but the way they did it was so different. Myself and so many other clergy members, our work is similar, but we do it differently. I want us to focus on the gifts that we have been given. We often lament the gifts we don't have or don't fully recognize the gifts we do. Taking time to reflect on the gifts you have been given is an opportunity to be grateful. But it's also a chance for us to grow closer to the divine as we ask this question about, like, God, what is my path? There is no reason to be competitive. Our work is our work. So 5 things about what you currently do that you're grateful for, and then 3 things that make you unique in how you do it. They're going to start singing the first song, so just take your time while you're doing that, and then at the end, we'll sing together.